affected. If evacuation is impossible, move indoors.
Hey guys, welcome back to the pit. Well, it's the end of another project, and I'm again left with another giant mess in my workspace.
Everything's in complete disarray because everywhere you look, there's parts of untransformed chaos yelling to you, do something about this, loser.
Today I'll be showing you how I built the corner apartment tile for the game Zombicide. After doing some research, I decided to model this tile off of some of the federal-style buildings found in New York or on the east coast of the US. Once I'd found some ideas I liked, it was time to get building. So first, I start off with the facade. I really like the look of this building here, so I decided to model the side of my building after it. I also wanted a building with a basement floor and a ground floor a little bit above street level, thus requiring a staircase. I started off by cutting out the side face of the facade using 3mm foam core board. I then ruled out the facade design, showing where I wanted pillars, protruding areas, and windows. For the side area of the building, I used these arch windows from Tichy Train Group. Once I had ruled out their position, I cut the area out with a hobby knife. To create the pillars and protruding areas on the facade, I decided to glue strips of the same 3mm foam core board onto the facade and then glue the construction foam, which I'd use later, on top of that. I start with the protruding area at the bottom of the facade and then the pillars. Next I cut out the individual sections of the facade in 6mm AK construction foam, including the window slots. These are then glued into place. Notice I leave a small gap at the bottom of the facade for the basement floor. When the side was done, I went over the same process for the front facade. This was a more complex design, which I largely based on this New York apartment building. And for the front face of the building, I decided to use these beautiful Tichy Train Group double hung windows.
That's what she said! Michael!
I then joined the two faces together using framing glue. And then glued the construction foam onto the front face. Notice that I left an empty spot at the top of the facade for the crown cornice. Once all the foam was glued on, I gave the front of the building a coat of white paint. And then I ruled out the building's brick pattern. I've been over this process in many of my videos, so I won't go into detail here. If you want more information, please click the link on the screen. However, there were some new challenges with this building, such as ruling out brickwork within the facade's cavities and arches. To get around the arches, I used various circular templates to get the desired result. As for the cavities, I used pieces of card cut to their exact width, which allowed me to create straight water lines from end to end. Once the lines had been ruled out, I created shallow cuts along the lines with a hobby knife, and then went back over it with a pencil to give the lines depth and width. I used gap filler to hide the join between the two sides and milliput to create a perfect edge on the building's front. Then finally, I used thick card to create door frames, which I glued on. Next, I created special window frames for the arched windows that stretch the complete width of the building's wall and can slot into the window's cavities later in the process. To do this, I cut styrene card the same width as the wall and joined the two frames together using this. Next, I built a decorative cornice moulding, very similar to the one pictured. I start by cutting a piece of styrene card the width of the building and the desired height. I then cut a short side piece, which was the same height, and I glue on at a right angle. I glued on a thin styrene strip to the top of the cornice. I then cut another ultra-thin rectangle of styrene card the same size as the cornice face with 3 evenly spaced rectangular holes across it. This was then glued onto the cornice face. Next, I glued on various lengths of flat styrene strip. To finish it off, I glued a curved strip across the top of the cornice. Then I moved on to the gutter. I took a large styrene angle strip and flat strip cut to the length of the side face of the building. I then took a few staples and cut them in half to create right angles. I then glued these onto the angle strip section of the gutter, creating the appearance of brackets holding the gutter up. And finally, I trim off any excess bracket with some wire cutters. Next, I created the downpipe. First, I took a styrene tube and cut it a little shorter than the building's height. I then cut multiple thin styrene strips, a little longer than the tube's diameter, to act as downpipe brackets. I then glued these brackets evenly along the downpipe's length, aligning the center of each bracket with the peak of the tube. Once they were fixed, I bend each bracket around the front of the tube and then flare them out at the point in which they'd be touching the wall they'd eventually be fixed to. I created the front doors of the building by cutting one thicker piece of styrene card, the same dimensions as the door frames, and then cutting another ultra-thin piece of styrene card to the exact same dimensions. I then cut 4 rectangles out of the thin piece of card to create door panels. This is then glued onto the thicker card. Finally, I glued on a door push plate and mail slot. I also decided to create a canvas awning, so I first had to build its frame. I start with a thin angle strip, which I cut into 3 pieces, 2 for the frame's width and 1 for its length, which I glue together. I then fix on 2 more strips, cut at 45-degree angles on each end to act as the rafters. I then added a batten and some small squares of card to act as the end brackets. I also wanted to add a trashy looking AC unit. I started by cutting out a square frame in styrene card, which would act as the face of the unit, and then cut a piece of fine wire mesh that would fill in the space in the frame. I then glued the mesh onto the back of the frame. Then I started painting the brickwork. I give the entire brick face a coat of red, brickish paint. Once the paint was dry, I cover the entire face with a mortar wash, which is a mix of white and grey pigment along with PVA glue and water. When that was dry, I dry brushed the face of the building using the same red paint. I then randomly select bricks to be coloured dark brown and light brown. And then painted the door frames using white. As I decided to create a ground floor that was above street level, I had to build an elevated floor. I did this by cutting up multiple squares of foam core board, the same dimensions as the building floor, leaving room for the front and rear walls, and glued them one on top of the other until the desired height was reached. I then build the rear walls and fix them to the back sides of the facade by cutting 2 slots and gluing the rear walls into them. Next, I cut out the pieces of embossed styrene card I would use as the floor and place them on the floor without gluing them. This would allow me to build the interior walls at the correct height without having to fix the building down to the base yet. I'll go into the interior builds detail in my next video, so that's all I'll cover today. Next, I needed to build the exterior stairs. To do this, I cut out 3 pieces of 6mm construction foam, the first being 3 cm square and each following piece being sequentially shorter than the prior by 1 cm, while keeping the same width. I then glued them one on top of the other in sequence, keeping them completely flush on one side to create stairs. I then cut 2 railings out of foam, slightly higher than the stairs, with a little tab that would fit under the gap between the sidewalk and the brickwork. I then slot the stairs into position without gluing them and cut strips of 1 cm thick foam to act as the basement floor of the building, peaking slightly above the footpath. I then paint the stairs and then the basement section grey. I then glue these to the sides of the building without fixing them down to the base. Once the glue was dry, I filled in the gaps in the basement section with gap filler, which I then smoothed out with a wet paintbrush. Next, I completed the painting of the facade. I then paint the stairs and basement floor a light grey and then give it a dark wash. I then dry brush the area with a mix of grey and white paint. I then gave the bricks another light mortar wash. I felt like I went overboard with the second mortar wash, so I painstakingly reshaded a lot of the bricks with the same red paint. Now onto the graffiti. I imagined that vandals would have a field day during a zombie apocalypse, so I added a few tags to the building. I picked a tag that I wanted to replicate and roughly drew it using a paint pen. I then coloured it in with black paint. While that was drying, I added a few simple tags with paint pens in various colours. I then drew on the lettering of the tag using white paint, leaving the black paint around the edges as a border. I then went back over the white lettering with black paint to give them some more definition and to create clean lines. I used a similar technique to create a skull image that I also found online. When the graffiti was done, it was time to fix the building to the base using some framing glue. Now I was on the final stretch and it was time to paint all the building's components and details. I used bits and pieces from various kits for scatter terrain, such as a Mantic Games battle damaged house and shop, TT Combat back alley accessories, a 3D printed washing machine and a Rubicon utility pole. I first coated a bunch of the metal items with a mix of grey and brown paint to create a rust look, which I would reveal with my paint chipping technique. I also gave the doors a greyish brown coat, which would also be revealed using the chipping technique. Next, I went about painting and detailing the components. I also painted up the windows and added some cracks to the glass panels before fixing them to the frames. Before I fixed on the lower sashes, I glued the AC unit into one of the windows. Then I glued on the lower sashes and created a variety of open and closed windows. Once the painting was done, it was time to fix the components down to the building. I first slotted in the doors and windows, and added a bit of rust pigment to the push plates and awning frame. And then added a few stickers to the utility door. Next, I glued on the cornice, the gutter, and the downpipe. For the downpipe, I drilled a small hole into one side and superglued in a needle, which I would then press into the brick face of the wall. I then stippled on a bit of rust pigment with a rough piece of sponge. Now it was time for the final weathering. Oh no, you chaotic troll demon, you! I start off by adding a dirt pigment wash around the base of the building, and then glued the painted scatter components into place. I used a pointed file to create a hole for the utility pole and glued it in. Next, I printed out some mini newspapers and food packaging, which I glued around squares of card. I also created multiple cardboard box templates using brown card. I then glued down a variety of grass tufts, leaf litter, and more dirt wash. Next, I glue down the newspapers, boxes, and food packages. I also add some ivy/foliage to the facade, and some rust streaks from the AC unit. And then finally, I built the canvas awning using a piece of baby wipe.
Steve-O's butt wipes for your butthole.
I then mixed PVA glue, green paint, and water, and submerged the wipe into the concoction. I placed the canvas on the frame and applied more PVA glue in order to fix the canvas in the desired position, which gave it some natural droop. And then I called this done. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for my next video where I show you how I built the tile's interior. And please remember to like and subscribe.